All right, it's just about time that we set to begin the presentation. So thanks to everyone that's joined us so far. I imagine we'll have some more trickling in. My name is Chris Holden. I'm the community manager here at Recorded Future. Just do a quick introduction of who we have on the line. From our side at Recorded Future, I have Christopher Alberg, our CEO and one of our co-founders. And then joining us today is Nathaniel Hansen, who is the CEO of a company called The Socializers, which is a global social business that operates across continents here, North America, Europe, Australia, and China. And he was elected in 2010 as one of the 18 world thought leaders in social business. So we're going to walk through a little bit of introduction to Recorded Future, do a quick live demo of some of our tools, and then we'll let Nathaniel take the reins and tell us a little bit about how he uses data from Recorded Future and then builds it into a bigger information network built upon social information. And with that, I'll hand it over to our CEO, Christopher, and take it away.
That's great. Thank you, Chris. And we should have some fun here today. So, all right, I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about Recorded Future and how we do things and set things up for the demo by Chris. So anyway, the thing that got us really excited about starting Recorded Future from the very beginning a couple of years ago was this idea that we saw that there was this opportunity to be able to find predictive signals in the internet or on the web. We all have sort of read these studies, if we call it that, about looking at Google search logs to predict flu outbreaks or unemployment, or looking at political blogs to draw signals about where political elections or polls are going, or looking at Twitter buzz to predict box office movie results. And we thought, wow, I wonder if we could actually kind of take a step back and build that out to, in a sense, that we could actually build a product platform and a service that would allow people to do this at large. That was the sort of the opportunity we set out. And at the same time, I think this is happening towards sort of a backdrop where in large companies around the world, business intelligence, as it's been called over the last, say, 50 years even, and I was part of doing this in my old life, of doing business intelligence where we took data from databases and data warehouses and buses and all sorts of IT infrastructure and turn it into reports that can be reviewed, how much, say, a company has sold last month, last quarter, compared to the same month 12 months ago, all of these sort of things. And whereas this is really wonderful and fantastic and can help one to sort of get into insights that one couldn't do before, in reality, I think what's happening is that if I walk into the most clever organizations on the planet, and maybe also not just the most clever organizations on the planet, and find that up-and-coming smart analyst who is looking to understand where his or her company is going, or where products are being used, or interesting enough, maybe where competitors are going, or where competitors' products are showing up, or what customers are thinking, all of these sort of things. Where do I find that young, clever analyst is actually finding this information? Is that in the sort of classic business intelligence sales report? Or do I find that person zooming around among social media and Twitter and Tumblr and clever ways of using Google and the best sort of reporters on news sites and what have you? And I actually think it's in the latter. We're seeing business intelligence moving from the classic sort of looking at reports towards being smart about taking advantage of unstructured content that is coming streaming at me in the cloud, on the internet. Now, that's all easy to say, but then, this is what I call the pain here, I think all of us, including myself, would like to think that I'm pretty clever at this stuff, will also feel that, man, we're just drowning in data and documents from the internet, but and with the risk of using a little bit of a cliche, I need actionable insights. It's fine to sort of zoom around and get all excited, but I also need to get this to be turned into insights that I can actually use. And so that's what we set out to do with Recorded Future. Let's understand how we can actually address some of these pains and actually make all this data on the internet useful for analysis. So the thing that got us started was that when you look on the web, and now we can think about mainstream news, government filings, blogs, all of these sort of things, social media, we find these signals that are temporal in nature. You know, look to things that are going to happen next week, next month, on Thursday by March 2014, on Saturday, these sort of things, and try to organize not only the time point, but together with the entities involved in that and the events, so that we can understand that Merck is going to open up a new factory in Malaysia on Friday, or early next year we expect Merck's CEO to step down, or next year we're going to see this drug coming off patent. What about if we could actually organize all that information and make it available for analysis in a sort of compelling environment? And so that turned out to be pretty exciting for us. And to do that, you need to be able to not just find all this text, but you actually need to structure it. So we were able to figure out how we could actually, from text, extract what we call events. And an event might be a merger, or a product launch, or product problems, or somebody saying something, or somebody traveling from A to B, lots of different events. I think we have some 100 different events of that sort. Combining that with time, so when things are happening, and then of course the actual sort of players in this, people, places, organizations, geographies, those sort of things. So doing that, and then be able to turn all this text into not just single instances of this, but actually fundamentally understanding that here's a merger between two companies that was reported first on this time point. We picked it up in 25 different reports on 14 different sources from 7 different countries, and so on and so forth. That's when we can sort of actually turn this into real analysis, and we sometimes call this temporal analytics. So the interesting thing to think about here is that we can go from actually browsing lots of web pages, a la sort of Google, to actually turning this into timelines. And so one thing that got us really excited recently here, because we've been out here sort of talking about timelines a couple of years here, and we also, Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook started talking about timelines in a big way about a month ago or so when they had their big timeline launch. And we said, look, what this is really about is timelining the world and timelining the web, if you want. So what we've set out to do in all of this is what we'd like to think about as our mission in life: record what the world knows about the future, and then accordingly make that available to people who need to do analysis. So my last piece will just to give you a little bit of a sense of sort of the machinery that we've built to do this, and then we're going to switch in and let Chris show you some actual examples. So we today map out some 50,000 sources. These sources ranges from sort of, again, mainstream media to government filings to niche media and magazines to blogs and social media sort of stuff. Lots of information that we process in real time, big machinery doing this. As we talked about before, we find entities and time and events and people talking, lots of different sort of core information coming out of that. We built a terrific machinery that can do this in real time. There's 40,000 sources, as I mentioned. One interesting little tidbit is how we find 100,000 future events every day. So you know, large number of events here that we extract that are highly interesting in their nature. This then gets organized into a big index. So think about this as sort of time-tagged facts. And we have some 3, and maybe it's getting closer to 4 billion of these now. Again, sort of big numbers, not really that important perhaps, but 40,000 sources, processing something like 300,000 documents every hour, getting every day some 100,000 facts that are going to occur in the future in here, and then into this big index. And then we make that available through the UI that Chris is going to show you here in a second, and then as well through an API where people then apply this in all kinds of different environments. We have a lot of users in financial markets who trade on our information, might put it in MATLAB and R. People have visualized it in applications like Spotfire and other sorts of environments. But with that, I wanted to turn over to Chris, who's going to tell you and maybe more importantly show you Recorded Future in use.
Sure. Ready to go, Christopher, if you want to send the control over to me. And what we'll do is kind of take it from this conceptual side where we're talking about events and entities and how these appear with temporal signals, and from there show how it actually can be represented in some different visual ways that we offer.
Good.
And so what we'll do is start with a small example. We'll go from something very specific to perhaps a wider net, customized scope that we can look at. And what we'd like to do is kind of start with a very small example and then move on to a customized bigger scope and then show some of the different ways we can visualize this. And just starting small with the focus on one company, we could look at something like Goldman Sachs represented as a company entity in our architecture here. So we select the company, and we can see that there's time sets in here. So we can look for, as Christopher mentioned, these future events. So a temporal signal that indicates something taking place over the next 60 days. And we'll keep it to relatively recent news, so published in the last 60 days. And if we search on this, what we'll see initially is a set of events drawn out over time. And each event here is referencing the company Goldman Sachs at some future time point that we've picked out over the next 60 days. It can be something pretty specific. We see something like a dividend being payable at a certain point in time. To, if we want to toggle these events a little bit, we look at merger and acquisition and business lines related news to filter that out. And we can see some different examples where we have Goldman Sachs expected to purchase Virgin Media in the open market, or a different one where it has a relationship between Goldman and Macquarie Capital. And we can start to filter out some of these specifics that we might be interested in. And again, these are future time points that we're looking at. And while here, it might be interesting to see the one company, oftentimes we want to look for a bigger scope at once. So what I've done here is prepared what we call watch list, which is a custom set of entities, so something like a company, Goldman Sachs, and combine some of the biggest U.S. banks into one net. And we can look over the same time frame here and now get an idea of the events to take place across the scope of these companies that are included in this custom net. And instead of some of the capital market stuff, maybe we want to see events that are accounting and restructuring, corporate growth, again, some more of these business alliance sort of events that we've categorized to see relationships. And what we can do once we filter those out is then pick our company of interest. So now we have beyond Goldman Sachs. We could look down here, see all the companies that are referenced in this scope of events on the timeline, and say, let's look at the events related to Citigroup. So we click on Citigroup, and we can see one of those events highlighted here, that the company is setting up an R&D center in Israel in December. Or separately, if we want to go with Bank of America, we can see the events that are relevant to them and see that there is some sort of court occurrence here to take place in November 22nd. One of the other things you can do, in addition, you see that there's this momentum line here, which indicates kind of the online buzz, the discussion around certain time points in these events. We can also quickly identify sentiment involved here, and that can be done in two ways. On a trend level, so you can see that we toggle on sort of the trends, green being positive, red being negative, of how there might be some linguistic cues that there's negative sentiment, positive sentiment around one of these events. And then we can also look on the individual event level. So maybe we want to find the most positively charged event. And now on the y-axis, we see events that have some positive language involved. Or separately, and maybe more interesting, we look at the negative events. And then I know it's moving pretty quickly, so I want to zoom through one or two other items here and show you one thing that we'll come back to a little bit more when Nathaniel takes over, is this idea of a source map that we have, where we can break out references to all of these events, so for biggest U.S. banks over the next 60 days, and see what sources are most prominent in discussing these events. So initially we have it broken out by country of source publication. So you can see the most prominent U.S. sources on these issues versus, say, the most prominent UK sources on these issues. This can also be broken down by media type or by topic. So media type suggesting the blogs versus the mainstream channels versus the niche business outlet. And these can also be looked at over time. So as we move this along, we see what sources actually reported later or on events that are set to take place farther in the future. So as we push this farther out, we can see the events, the sources that are reporting on events farther out in the future. And the last piece here that I want to show is a new feature that we just launched, which is a network graph. And so instead of just a big sort of view of all events related to U.S. banks, we could look at something like legal issues. So company legal issues related to this set of banks, and then over a certain period of time. So we could say during the year 2011. And we want to look at the legal issue events that we can find for these companies and actually map them out and see where there may be some relationships between individuals, other companies, who's suing who, and look at this over time. So when we first draw up the network graph, we're going to see that there are connections between our big U.S. banks, some other companies, some individuals, and then as we expand this out, you can see that we have some entities clustered in here, kind of a 75, 100 more. And when we expand this, it's going to draw a really dense set of connections between these companies that have some sort of legal relationship. And when this settles, we'll start to see the different companies clustered in different sections. So you can see that J.P. Morgan Chase is over on this side with some of the companies that it's been related to in these legal events. If we select any of these nodes, we can actually see what that event is. And as we make this, we expand this network a little bit, some of the most interesting points are maybe companies that actually connect between some of these bigger nodes of U.S. banks. So kind of zooming out here so we can get a little bit better of an idea of what's connected to what. We may see examples of some companies like this LDL patent, for example, that's going to connect a couple different companies. Or we might want to look at an individual and say, Irving Picard, this individual, does he have connection somewhere else as well? And by double-clicking on this node, we'll actually get an expanded network for the individual. And then we can see what other companies during this same time frame he may have had legal ties with. And this can go on and on, kind of down the rabbit hole here. But the neat thing is that you can actually draw this out and see how these relationships actually developed over time, given the time slider. So down at the bottom, we can start towards the end, towards the beginning of 2011, and actually take this forward and see how some of these ties developed. If we select LML patent, for example, we see they first had legal issues with Citigroup, and then as we go forward in time here, we can see some of those other relationships expand. So Citigroup, Wells Fargo, and selecting that node, we can actually find the relationship. And so we can kind of map out really dense sets of related entities in this way and see how the network evolves over time and dig into this more and more. So with that, I kind of want to step away from the live demo and hand it over to Nathaniel. And I think he's going to start off by looking and taking off on this source map that we have and how he's used it in his work and then gone further into some really deep social intelligence work. And so with that, I'm going to slide over to Nathaniel's PowerPoint slides, and when you're ready, go ahead and take it over.
Right. So can you hear me, Chris, by the way?
I can hear you. Give me one moment just to bring up the slides here.
Well, it's a real honor to be on the webcast today with Recorded Future. I deeply respect Recorded Future and their staff and what they've put together. And we've certainly found in our social intelligence projects for brands, for banks, and for agencies, Recorded Future to be an invaluable resource.
One of the projects that I've been working on is something that I've sort of nicknamed after something that's been talked about much further before I brought up the idea, which is the worldwide mind. So I certainly did not invent that term. But what you have before you on the screen is a kind of wheel of social properties that all have sort of relevance in different respects. So for instance, you know, down at the bottom we've got Facebook, obviously. You know, over up towards the top we've got StumbleUpon or Quora. We've got LinkedIn there, and then a couple of tools like Researchly or, you know, Jive, a couple of different social tools. The basic connection between the influencer or source map at Record a Future and my work inside of this wheel is that then I can take those influencers that have been discovered through the work of Record a Future and discover conversations around them within this wheel of social properties. Now, some may apply more than others. I mean, World of Warcraft may be a place where I'm researching, you know, budding currency traders who are working with, you know, virtual currencies, and that may not be applicable to, say, some political issue, but it may be as well. In Quora or in LinkedIn, we may have conversations and questions happening that are related, and that influencers inside of the influencer map at Record a Future are participating in. Certainly, Record a Future has the predictors group in LinkedIn, and there's a lot of interesting conversations there about, you know, temporal analytics and other things. So I'm closely watching that out of my own interest. On the next slide, you'll see where we actually then can take our work inside of this wheel, if we could go to the next slide, and turn that into a kind of spreadsheet. So, I mean, the spreadsheet that you see online here is a fairly innocuous one for a yoga star in California that I work with. But, you know, certainly with banks and with other organizations that I'm working with, I'm developing these and looking at not only Twitter, not only Facebook, but also looking deeper into Clout, looking at LinkedIn, looking at relationships within LinkedIn, looking at relationships and questions within Quora, looking at journalists and looking at their conversations in Twitter, on and on and on. Now, a spreadsheet like you're seeing below, this sort of dashboard of social icons, can then, if we could go to the next slide, be basically turned into, you know, a actionable center, where, as we see here with the Gatorade brand, you know, they have a sort of mission control where Radiant 6 and Hootsuite and, you know, another number of other tools have been integrated, and a spreadsheet of social intelligence has then sort of become alive, as it were, and all of the important people that would be in an influencer map at Recorded Future would then be part of conversation marketing, say, for a brand, or content marketing is another way of looking at that. There's opportunities in terms of PR within this kind of a room. There's opportunities in terms of, you know, HR and finding people who would work in our organization and might be better for us, or might be appropriate for us, or might add to the team that we have. So certainly around every silo, a room like you're looking at here, which the birthplace of that room can very well come out of an influencer map in Recorded Future, and then be expanded through research in social properties, turned into spreadsheets, and then those spreadsheets, again, to repeat myself, can be put into lists, say, in Twitter that are monitored in Hootsuite or in TweetDeck, or are more deeply explored through Radiant 6 or through tools like Qualia, as we have in Europe, or tools like Sysomos that are global. So, you know, there's a lot of different ways into, obviously, the social networks, but this is just one way, and I think it's very potent to go in through the influencer map and Recorded Future, because we can also link that to a timeline, as was being talked about at the outset, where we can kind of see conversations and make a decision about conversations that have happened in the past or happening right now, and link those to events in the future. A very interesting activity is to take a kind of timeline with press about an event in the future, engage in conversations with influencers out of the influencer map right now, and watch the effect upon those future press releases real time through the recorded future interface. Let me go deeper into that. If I see an announcement about an individual that's having a legal dispute, and then a conversation is engaged in within the social networks that somehow affects that, we may see a different headline coming up, even within the next 24 hours in the future. So it's a very nice way of kind of seeing what's happening in the past, what's happening now, and how we could affect future events. I think that's all I have to say at this point. Certainly happy to take questions about anything I've said on this. But I would add, as a kind of closing, that I'm very, very excited about the influencer and source map at Recorded Future and how that helps me in my own social intelligence work for brands, agencies, and banks. I'll turn it back to Chris.
All right, thanks, Nathaniel. And I think that about concludes what we had in terms of a straight presentation. I can see that there are some questions that have already come in. And if you have anything that's come up during the course of our presentation, please feel free to send it in the chat now, and we'll do our best to get to everyone that has a question here.
You want to sort of portion out the questions, Chris?
Yep, just taking a look now and looking to see as one or two others come in. So give me 1 second. All right, so let's see first. Let's get one question first. This is kind of a big question, but maybe you can provide some context here, both Christopher and Nathaniel. You know, this is a big question. What are the top 3 questions corporate clients are trying to solve by way of web mining? And kind of a broad.
Sure, I've got answers for that. I can dive into that.
Sure.
Okay. So we're wondering, in terms of social intelligence, the big questions that are being asked are, you know, what's the volume of mentions around a topic, a keyword, an entity? You know, what kind of news headlines and developing stories are influencing my brand right now? You know, are there some kind of sort of hidden topics or sort of conversations that I didn't know about that are influencing my brand? You know, do people think positively or negatively about my brand? Just a straight out question from a CEO, from a CMO. You know, I've got a few more here if that's okay. You know, other questions we're getting are kind of like, you know, do people, you know, are they sort of relaxed about my brand? Do they feel calm? Do they feel excited? You know, what's the emotion, you know? You know, and also people are wondering about the time of day, you know, in terms of advertising and planning around advertising. Like, what time of day are people talking about my brand? And when they're talking about it at that time of day, like, what's the topic? Like, what are they saying about it at that time of day? A lot of people who are asking us to do work for them want to know who they are connected to that they didn't know they were connected to in the social networks. And they want to have recommendations about influencers related to their brand. Who could be a brand ambassador, for instance? And then finally, they want to know, like, how could we spread an idea or a meme through, you know, a customer population? When could we do it? What would it say? And what are they talking about that we could sort of attach to that would make sense with our current initiatives? So these are the kinds of questions that I'm getting and the kinds of sort of pushes that I'm getting from, you know, chief marketing officers and from business unit managers at agencies, for example.
That's great. Maybe I can add that the 2 other areas where we're getting lots of interest in and where we're sort of spending a lot of our time in is, one is in trading, so actually straight out using this sort of information in trading, both where it's used in sort of what you'd call algorithmic trading, where people weave this sort of information into algorithms for making stock equity selection, as well as by human sort of discretionary traders and investment managers who uses the tools to actually identify information that might, you know, and we saw this from Chris's demo before, you know, if I'm going to go buy Citibank shares and there's an upcoming negative lawsuit, maybe I just want to wait until that lawsuit is passed before I go buy those shares. Or maybe I've researched that lawsuit a whole lot, so they actually think I should buy the shares because everybody else is overestimating how important it is. So that's one area, in financial trading. And then another area is certainly in competitive intelligence. Just, as much as people many times think they have a total grip on what the competition is doing, at the same time, that's a hard problem. And finding clever ways to understand what the competition is doing is certainly an area where we've had some good success. So I would add those. I also saw that there was a question here about what platform have we actually built this on top of, and I'll say that it's sort of a proprietary platform. We, the whole machinery from ingestion of underlying sources to doing the whole sort of, as you can imagine, lots of text parsing here, clearly temporal extraction, but also lots of other sort of text parsing, and dealing with a very, very large database. A lot of people talk about big data these days. This clearly is a big data problem. And then figuring out so that we can query, you saw those queries that Chris was doing this network analysis that, is asking very big questions of these big databases, and doing that at sort of what I like to call think speed, that sort of immediate response time is a non-trivial problem, and we've been doing that ourselves, pretty much from ground up, using components, but it's a proprietary platform underneath. We had another question here I saw. Does the platform offer the ability to measure the ripples of past similar events against identified future events? That's a great question. We have done those sort of things on a math point of view, sort of using our API, going back and looking at volatility in the markets, for example, from events, and then comparing upcoming events to that. We have not built that into the UI yet, but clearly that's something that we could be doing here, both looking at sort of media ripples, but also things like, for example, volatility in markets and so on. It's a very nice product feature to be built here. It's on the list. We had another great question here. Would it be possible to touch on journalistic applications of the Recorded Future app? I'm happy to talk about that, but I don't know, Nathaniel, is that something you'd like to touch on? Potential.
I missed part of what you said. Your voice dropped out. Could you say that again?
Of course. So would it be possible to touch on journalistic applications of the Recorded Future application?
Oh, certainly. So, obviously, one of the big conversations, I'm not going to say obviously to me because I've been watching this, but one of the conversations in journalism has been between the classic journalist who, is that forager and adventurer out into the world. I'll just take it kind of more romantically there. But next to the person that's the curator of information, who's actually aggregating information and curating it and segmenting it, and then sort of like communicating it. So with Recorded Future, we have a tremendous tool for obviously aggregating information around any entity or topic, and then I would say, curating it, as it were, getting very specific with it. Now, there's a lot of, there has been, I won't be dramatic with it, but there has been a fair amount of debate around the difference between a classic journalist and a curator of news. But certainly curation is a massive part of journalism currently. The speed with which we can curate is different than the past. So one might say that, oh, well, we've always curated in a way. Okay, maybe. But Recorded Future, just to kind of finish up here, is sort of, in a way, the ultimate or an ultimate or superior method, I would say, from my perspective, on curation of news. What that means is segmentation of massive aggregated articles and then finding the best, the creme de la creme. That would be my answer to that question.
Thank you. That's an excellent answer. The other sort of, just to sort of add to that, is that a lot of the work that we do is in, call it, intelligence. So helping people, gather information and organize it and try to come up with conclusions around it, either on very short-term sort of topics, whether you're, say that you're an NGO who's going to provide help in a location and you'd like to be able to get a grip on what's going on in that location before you start distributing food, for example, or you're sort of looking at long-term questions that you'd like to understand. Maybe, again, you're an NGO and you're trying to understand what continents should we focus on over the next 5 years. So, those sort of questions. So both sort of tactical and strategic decisions. And in both of those cases, those are applications that we're spending a lot of time on. So, and I think actually with taking a journalist hat on, it's essentially very similar sort of questions, but just with a twist on it. So, yeah, no, that we're very excited about journalistic type of applications. Cool. Chris, did you get any other questions in on, because we get them through two channels here, I think.
Yeah. There were one or two others, and one might be a good, one's going to be a short one, I think. And then one I think is probably good to step in first, since you were talking about government applications briefly in intelligence. One question said, talk to the most common problem sets from a government customer perspective. And then maybe if you want to answer this one first, is how do you define the term prediction in terms of what we talk about for text analytics here? So how do we frame the term prediction?
Good question. I think, and that's always sort of when you get to the word prediction, it's easy to sort of fall in the crystal ball trap. I was going to say another word there, but crystal ball trap. So I think, the most sort of basic thing that we do is that we organize what the world knows about the future. So the world knows a whole lot. Let's put it together and organize it so that I can say, I want to know everything that is going to happen in Venezuela next week, next month, next year, and be able to get that organized for me. That's pretty interesting. Now, that's also maybe the most straightforward thing we can do. The other sort of thing is obviously the more subtle, to say, is there buzz around Venezuela rising over the short term or the long term in such a way that I can actually draw some conclusions about, even without having explicit references to what's going to happen in Venezuela. I can kind of get the sense that something is going on, or suddenly Venezuela starts showing up in the context of another country that they never showed up in the context of before, or suddenly leaders from a set of countries start talking about Venezuela who's never talked about Venezuela before. And all of these sort of things can be used in predictive manner. And so we try to think, not only think about it, but actually we've implemented lots of these different aspects in our platform. And then this gets used again by either, when you're looking at these sort of 5-year out sort of long-term questions, a lot of this is to empower an analyst, and actually even speaking to the second question here about from a government point of view, clearly to empower an analyst who knows everything there is to know about Venezuela and help that person do his job. Other sort of applications in the very short term, for example, financial trading applications we work in, a human may never see the information. It goes straight into a computer algorithm. So I think, the idea from a, prediction in terms of text analytics, there are some very strict sort of temporal linguistics that we do that we'd like to think that we've done better than anybody else in terms of being able to extract temporal expressions out of text and be able to then aggregate that across entities and events. That's probably the most technical sort of thing that we do in terms of prediction of text and text analytics. But then, of course, the bigger thing is to say, look, we consume 300,000 pages of new text every hour. How can we actually extract predictive patterns out of those? And to be honest, I always make the point, sometimes I need to go back and look at what's written 2 years ago and look at that in aggregate to tell something about what's going to happen in 2 years going forward. Maybe an extreme case, but to look into the future, sometimes you need to look into the past. So, and then, I tried here by talking about Venezuela or, whatever you want, to weave into the idea from a government customer perspective. So most of the work that we've been doing in government has been in this sort of, with a large sort of umbrella term of intelligence around it, and trying to help people in that world be able to do what you'd call open source intelligence. So the way that we, in open source is no difference from sort of thinking about as media intelligence. We've mapped out media sources from around the world. Chris didn't spend too much on that, but, you want to track people, you want to track organizations and companies and countries and geographies, and say, look, I'm interested in, we talked about Venezuela, so maybe I want to see what the Brazilian media is saying about Venezuela, or maybe I want to see what Brazilian leadership, as it's quoted in Brazilian media, is saying about Venezuela. To be able to, take the whole world's media sort of sample, and then actually be able to take these sort of very specific cuts out of it that can allow me to see either the very big picture or very narrow slivers out of this in ways that just never been done before. We think, without being too humble, with the risk of not sounding very humble, we're building the most advanced capability in open source, period, here, I think is maybe one way to think about it from a government perspective. And I realize that did not sound very humble, but it's not that particular part was not aiming to be humble, so.
And it's interesting, Chris, to draw threads from that work into the various social networks and leading social properties to conversations that are going on all the time in threads under blogs, in threads on, specific groups, and obviously in Twitter feeds, and on and on and on. There's just so many conversations going on around specific topics that then we can draw threads directly to those findings, and create even more depth with, as it were. So that, it's pretty phenomenal, the depth to which one can go at this point in history, and relative to conversations, just that as a topic.
And that might actually be a good segue into another question that we had here. Was Kenneth City use this to track Twitter and social media to follow problems like crime and infrastructure chatter, or to track current and then facilitate predicting future incidents? So maybe something both of you guys can speak to a little bit.
Yeah, maybe I'll speak first to just the technical aspects. So we do not track today all of Twitter. We track portions of Twitter that are related to the area. Given what we're doing, we've been hesitant to sort of, there's multiple levels to that. Twitter is actually, there's all kinds of issues about taking on the whole Twitter feed or even portions of it, among them that your signal-to-noise ratio changes quite dramatically. And then there's all kinds of things. But we do track portions of Twitter here. And then there's other interesting aspects that you need to suddenly deal with a whole different sort of language. So event detection in Twitter ends up being quite different from doing it in a New York Times article or what have you. But we do some of that, and the application that was just mentioned is clearly one that could be interesting, depending on what portions of Twitter that you look for. I did not hear all. What did you say, Chris? Did you say infrastructure to monitor potential infrastructure damage, or what was the question there?
That's right. Yeah, it was related to incidents surrounding infrastructure, and then also predicting future events around that. So it's not it's not totally clear what infrastructure means in this context, but.
It could mean the cyber infrastructure, and we've shown, you can find on our blogs where we've shown examples of finding hackers who are making public words, putting out public words on Twitter and elsewhere about places that they'd like to attack. Being able to find those early on can obviously be incredibly helpful. And now, it all depends on how open people are about talking about these infrastructure threats. Some groups will have interest in doing that. Some other groups won't. So there's a little bit, it depends in all of that. One question, just a more tactical question. We got a private question here from somebody who said, could you give a short demo of Recorded Future on a topic of your choice? And clearly, so I just asked Chris here to add to the slide here his email address. So he'll put the email address here on the slide, and you can just send Chris Holden an email, and he will he'll be very happy to set up call it a private demo where we show things to whatever really ever you'd like to see. Great. Any other questions or comments? Otherwise, I think we'll have to say thank you very much for very compelling questions, and this was fun, and we'd love to keep talking to you guys.
All right. Looks all clear over here for the most part.
Excellent.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, and we'll follow up with video as well as contact information so you can check in with either myself or Nathaniel after the presentation. Thanks again.